Aloha everybody, this is Kai, and welcome back to another episode of Kai's Creatures. Now, you might not know this about me, but entomology, and by extension biology and paleontology, is not the only interest I have. I also have a very deep interest in linguistics, culture, and history, and today we are going to blend those two things together. Today, we take a trip back to the land of ancient Egypt to discuss what is undoubtedly an icon of the ancient world. The scarab beetles. What exactly is a scarab beetle? Well, simply put, a scarab beetle is a beetle in the family Scarabidae. This includes a lot of the most well-known beetles, such as your rhino beetles, like the Hercules beetle and the Japanese rhinoceros beetle, or kabutomushi, your dung beetles, and your flower beetles, such as the Goliath beetle, the Japanese beetle, and of course, my little derby flower beetle here. Stag beetles, like my little plushie toy here, are not technically scarabs, but they are in the superfamily Scaraboidae, so that kind of makes them sorta scarabs. It's like a you're invited to the barbecue but don't change your last name or anything kind of thing. Generally, any beetle that has that kind of bulky oval shape to it is probably in the family Scarabidae, if not Scaraboidae at least. The specific species of beetle we're referring to today is the Egyptian dung beetle, Scarabaeus sacra. If you look at ancient Egyptian art, either in carvings or on amulets, you might be fooled into thinking these beetles are much more interesting looking than they really are. Usually depicted with hues of blue, green, or turquoise with trim of gold and fiery red, but really they're just like this. A simple, medium-sized black beetle that is not particularly remarkable among its family members. The cultural significance of the Egyptian scarab beetle is a lot more interesting. Interesting as in interesting, and also as in interesting. Scarab represents the Egyptian god Khepri, who is the god of the rising sun. Not to be confused with Horus, the god of the sun, or Ra, the god of the sun. Sun was a big thing in Egypt, okay? Look at that head, though! Look at it! It's just a whole bug slapped across his face. Don't get me wrong, some of them look cool. Anubis looks cool. Sobek looks cool. But Khepri's... At least his head, Sobek's head is replaced with the head of a crocodile, and that's how most of them are. But Khepri's just like a whole bug for a head. You gotta admit, that's kind of funny. To be fair, Khepri is often depicted as just being a scarab himself overall, which is a lot better. Now, why is a dung beetle associated with the rising sun and renewal and rebirth? Now, it may seem strange to you and I, but the reason the Egyptians associated these things with dung beetles is because of the many behaviors that make a dung beetle a dung beetle. They will gather around piles of excrement, gather some up and roll it away in balls like this. The reason they do this is to later plant their eggs in that ball of dung, which their larvae will then live off of and be born from. So it may seem odd, but the Egyptians actually saw a very deep symbolism in this. They saw this rolling orb as sort of a symbol of the sun rolling across the sky, and in raising their offspring from the excrement of other animals, they saw that as a form of rebirth, as an expression of, rising from the ashes. Now, analytically, I can kind of see the symbolism here, but I don't know. If I were a glorious god of the rising sun and a bunch of humans decide that some beetle that rolls around balls of crap and eats it is what represents me, I don't know, I might be a little offended. They would never do Apollo or Amaterasu dirty like that. Now, the reason the scarab motif is found absolutely everywhere in ancient Egypt from the Old Kingdom onward is because of how many things rebirth can represent. It's not just, rebirth into the afterlife, which is why you see scarabs commonly depicted in funerary proceedings as well as in tombs, etc. But it's just rebirth in general. In the case of the pharaoh, it's, it represents the pharaoh rising to power once again once the old one dies. It represents, climbing out of adversity from a period of darkness. It represents healing. when your body was in its twilight. You know, it represents a lot of things other than just the sun rising. You would see these things as amulets wrapped in the bandages of mummies. You would see these things, you know, in people's pockets and worn as necklaces and given to friends, family members, foreign dignitaries, etc. Like, they became popular trade items, and kings would have them on their rings, you know, as a royal seal of sorts, because often there would be hieroglyphics carved on the backside of the scarab amulet. Although I can't help but feel if the Egyptians saw the dung beetles we have here in the US, that they might be a little jealous. And that symbolism of renewal and rebirth is sort of still relevant today, because dung beetles overall are actually very good at redistributing waste throughout the environment and recycling that waste into new life and into soil that can be, you know, used to propagate new life. So in a way, even scientifically, the theme of rebirth and renewal with the scarabs, specifically the dung beetles, is actually pretty on point. And in a way, a lot of ancient societies were kinda silly about some things, but in a lot of ways they were actually pretty deeply philosophical, and they could see the serious side of things, like the relation between scarab beetles and poop. Poop is a fact of life, folks, and it's very relevant to the overall environment. Now, modern people might giggle at the thought, but nonetheless, like, on an absolute scientifically minded level, poop is a perfectly serious thing. For the ancient Egyptians to worship a bug that rolls around balls of crap it seems a little silly at first, but when you really think about it, perhaps the Egyptians were just much more serious than we were. Then again, people are people and have always been people, so I'm pretty sure that even the ancient Egyptians themselves couldn't help a giggle when they thought about it too hard. But it also shows that the people of ancient Egypt, which was known as Khemet at the time, by the way, if you didn't know that, but it shows that they were aware of the little things in life. All the little subtle things that go on in the background that make life what it is. Of course, also, they paid homage to the big, dangerous, very noticeable creatures in their lives, such as the crocodile, which is represented in the god Sobek that I mentioned earlier. So, as silly as it might seem to worship a dung beetle, in a way, it, to me, kind of shows how mature they were as a culture. Like, they were an agricultural people for the most part. So, them taking notice of a much more humble creature that actually has a huge effect on their society is very telling to me. It shows that they can notice things that most people don't notice, and they can philosophically understand the fact that not everything that seems larger than life is as big of a deal as you think it is, and not everything important has to be big, amazing looking, and glorious in its presentation. Sometimes the little or even just downright silly things in life actually have a much larger overarching effect on all of society than you might think at first. People will think of the Greeks as the great philosophers of the ancient world, but a lot of their ideas actually started in Egypt. The ideas of more oblique symbolic thinking, a lot of them started in Egypt, and the scarab is just an example of one of those things. If you have a deity that is represented by a crocodile or a lioness or an eagle, like, that symbolism is a lot more blatant. Like, it feels like you could not even know who you're looking at, and you kind of already have an idea of what you're dealing with. But with Khepri, it's like, okay, here's this guy with a bug head. What's he all about, you know? It's something that you're forced to look into it. You know, you can't make assumptions about what he represents, because if you take a god with the head of a bug and try to guess what he's about, you'd probably be wrong. So that is my scientific, cultural, and philosophical take on the Egyptian scarab. Obviously, this is one of the more famous examples of bugs represented in culture, but if you liked this video and you want to see more things like this, just go ahead and drop it in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one, folks. Aloha.